Hello, I'm Roger Gibbons. I'm a member of the Herts and Middlesex Committee and the European Committee. In Herts and Middlesex, we have about half of the UK's resident and regular migrant species, and the remaining half are dotted around the UK, sometimes very localised, and many of them quite long distances from our region. This presentation is very much a travelogue around the UK. A chance to look at butterflies at a time when we won't see any outside. And I should add that there are people in the audience who will know a lot more about some of these species than I do. Just by way of introduction, many of the images are my own. Some of them were taken in France, but then the species are identical to the UK species anyway. And some of the images that I didn't have from the UK, I borrowed from the excellent UK Butterflies website. With permission, but I think I have to say that the copyright remains with the image owner. We start with a very appealing little butterfly, silver-studded blue. Most of the colonies are found in southern England. For instance, there's a very famous one at Studland Heath. There are some colonies in Wales and in the east of England. And the most celebrated one, I think, is the Priest Heath Reserve in Shropshire, which is a site that was purchased by Butterfly Conservation in, I think it was 2006, and is managed by Butterfly Conservation for the benefit of the silver-studded blue.
Roger, sorry to interrupt. We can't see any slides at present. I don't know if you're trying to share, but you probably need to just share the slides.
Is that better? Sorry, I thought I pressed.
Yes.
Right. Okay, thank you for telling me. Could have gone a long way without seeing any butterflies. Okay, well, that basically is silver-studded blue. It's a charming little butterfly, and I suspect that there were many colonies that were under-recorded. I can remember 50 years ago wandering around East Budley Common near Exmouth and finding a small colony of silver-studded blues, but I'm not sure they were ever recorded on any distribution maps at that time. As you can see here, the male on the top and the underside top right, and the female on the lower row. Now, for some reason, it's not advancing. I think I'm going to have to advance them manually.
It's not. I don't think it's on slideshow mode, Roger, because we can see the thumbnails down the side.
Right.
You get it onto slideshow.
I'm trying to get it on slideshow, but
oh, there it is. Yeah.
Wait a minute. For some reason, it's not going on to slideshow. Let me stop share for a second. I'm going to have to advance them manually, I'm afraid. When we tested this just before I started speaking, it all worked fine. Is that okay? Can everybody see pearl border fritillary?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I can't seem to get it full screen. So you probably have to just see the thumbnails down.
There's a little button that's showing that says slideshow and then resume slideshow with the red border on it on the top left of your screen. Can you click on resume slideshow? Can you see that?
I can't see. Hang on. Yeah, but I can't seem to get my cursor to land on it. Right. Okay.
Oh, that's better.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, so you've done
Apologies
it.
for that. Okay. 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 Next up, pearl-bordered and small pearl-bordered fritillary. The pearl-bordered fritillary was once very widespread across Britain, and like most species, it's now only widespread in certain areas in northern Scotland, Cumbria, Devon and Cornwall, and in certain woodlands of southeast England. It's not quite clear why its distribution should have become so limited, but its ecological requirements are quite specific. It needs plenty abundant food plants, dog violet, and it also appears to need sort of fairly sparse vegetation. Small pearl-bordered fritillary, by contrast, is more widespread, but it prefers different type of terrain. It prefers more damp terrain, open grassland, woodland clearings, and also moorland, places where you wouldn't find pearl-bordered fritillary. One imagines that they both started from the same origin and then separated in evolutionary terms. It's small pearl-bordered is still widespread and quite locally abundant in Scotland and Wales, but it's a severe decline in England, which seems to be the case frankly for most species. It's now very much limited to the west of Britain and is, I think, limited to very few localities in the east. I don't think they ever fly together, but it's quite easily distinguishable from pearl-bordered fritillary. Probably the easiest way from the upper side view is if you can see the little marginal marks, which are solid triangles for pearl-bordered, and they're more like chevrons, V-shaped for small pearl-bordered. And of course, from the underside view, you've got the one single white mark in the middle of the hind wing for pearl-bordered and a whole series of them for small pearl-bordered. And the small pearl-bordered also uses dog violet, so they're clearly both come from the same source. This is large heath, and this is a species which is very much restricted to the sort of cooler, boggy habitats in northern Britain. There's actually quite a few species across Europe which are limited to cool and boggy habitats and can't adapt to it anywhere else. It's in northern Britain, a few isolated sites in Wales and central England, and I believe there's one site in Lincolnshire. And like many what can be described as cool species, it flies in dull weather, even has been known to fly in the rain. The key differentiator from its close relative, the small heath, and they were very imaginatively named by the early entomologists, weren't they? Large heath and small heath, are the ocelli on the hind wing, the eye spots. There are several subspecies in Britain, geographical subspecies. On the left is the subspecies Davis, which occurs in lowland England. And on the right, the Scottish subspecies Scotica. And in the middle is intermediary forms, which for reasons that are not totally clear, has a subspecies name of Polydama. The Scotica form is superficially very similar to small heath, but the sort of white markings on the hind wing are quite definitive, although I'm not sure that they probably ever fly together. The nominate form, Tullia, doesn't fly in Britain, but it depends on what you read. There's different publications tend to state different things on Tullia. It apparently only flies in continental Europe. Whether it ever flew in England and Britain is unclear. It's also a species that's declined seriously in England and Wales, but like many species that occur in Scotland, it's continued and hasn't seen the same reduction in its numbers in Scotland. There also used to be strong colonies, I believe, around in the environs of Manchester, but I think they have long since disappeared, wiped out by development. But despite its localization in the strong colonies in good years, they can apparently emerge in hundreds, and I think in some cases even in thousands. On to two hair streaks. We take black hair streak first. This is a very elusive species, I'm sure you know. I'm sure there's many things that I'm telling you that are already quite well known. But it's quite elusive in terms of both its distribution and its behaviour. It's confined to thickets of blackthorn, the larval host plant, in woodlands and specifically on clay soils. Very much limited to a sort of diagonal band across central England from Oxford to Peterborough. And I think there's one site further north in Lincolnshire. It's declined quite steadily over the decades, and I think it's down now to about 50 sites. One of the reasons for this is that as a species, it's quite sedentary and it's often limited to a small area, even within its within a wood, and it tends not to colonize adjacent territory, even if that territory is quite suitable for it. One of the best locations I find to see black hair streak is Glapthorn cow pastures in a wooded region in the north of Northamptonshire. And I think this is an ideal location to see it because there are a number of tracks that crisscross this wooded area, so you can see everything from tracks without disturbing the habitat. And there's also a little patch of bramble in the centre of this region where they come down to nectar, so they're quite amenable to photographers. I think this one, which was taken at Glapthorn a few years ago, is possibly a female, judging from the body shape, but the body shape of hair streaks is quite deceptive, I find. I have to say, I was quite pleased to get this photograph because for many years, my best photograph was one that was taken that was about 3 meters up in a bush, and the resulting photograph was postage stamp size. On the left, we have green hair streak, which is widespread throughout Britain, but it's quite elusive in that its colour, and it's the only naturally green species, gives it good camouflage, and it's not a species that frequents gardens, so it doesn't often get widely recorded. Also, I mean, its green colour is camouflage, so it often gets missed. I think in Herts and Middlesex there have been rare sightings, mostly singles. I believe, and you can correct me if I'm mistaken on this, these are mostly in southwest Middlesex and in the west in the Chiltern borders. Whether it's always been absent from central Hertfordshire is not clear. I think there are historical records, but I can remember when I was about 13 and I lived in Boreham Wood, I remember seeing green hair streak in what we call Bluebell Woods in the area between Boreham Wood and Radlett. But then I have to say at that time, I used to see a lot of white letter hair streaks, and I thought that was a common species. This is one of the most iconic rare species, is the Heath Fritillary. It's one of the smaller fritillaries, about the same size as a pearl bordered, maybe slightly smaller, same size as a Glanville Fritillary, and it's in very serious danger of extinction. It's limited to locations in the far southwest of England, on Exmoor and some sites in Essex and Kent, possibly the best known one being Blean Woods near Canterbury. But it's a bit of a puzzle to me as to why it should be so limited in England, because it's incredibly widespread in France, almost to the point of being ubiquitous. And it's probably true to say that it would have become extinct by now if it wasn't for the conservation and habitat management efforts of organisations such as Butterfly Conservation. This is a large tortoiseshell, upper side on the left and the underside on the right. It was once widespread across Britain, mostly in the woodlands of central and southern England, but it declined quite sharply and became extinct sometime in the 1960s. And its demise might have been a consequence of Dutch elm disease, which wiped out most elms, which are the larval host plant. But it's still quite common in parts of Europe, declining in others. And in France, it's widespread, but I see it quite frequently, but usually only in singles and very low densities. There are records from in Britain from time to time, but it's rather suspected that these may be releases rather than migrants. And it also should be mentioned that a few years ago, I think in 2014, there was quite an influx of the very similar scarce tortoiseshell, or I think it's also called yellow-legged tortoiseshell, across eastern England, which clearly come in on maybe on favourable winds from the continent. Not quite strictly true that you won't see this in our region. Adonis blue. It's another species that's undergone a major decline in its entire range. But although it's quite restricted in its range, it has recently, over recent years, expanded in some of its regions. Its strongholds are mostly in south central England, in the south of Sussex and in Kent. And I believe it's seen in the Chilterns as well, around, I think there's a spot near Pulpit Hill where I've been able to see it. It's double brooded, but like many double brooded species, it comes out in the greatest numbers in the second brood, and the numbers can vary quite considerably according to the breeding conditions. And in fact, the second brood, sometimes you can count them in hundreds. And equally, like the Heath Fritillary, it's rather puzzling why this should be so rare and limited in England. Because again, in France, if I compare it to France, the Adonis blue is almost ubiquitous. And in fact, it's almost as common as the common blue. So why it should be so limited in England is a bit of a puzzle. It's not quite true that you won't see this in Herts and Middlesex, because there have been recent sightings at Thurfield Heath. And it would appear that these are the result of deliberate releases, given that our nearest locations to Hertfordshire are in the Chilterns. But it does appear, and others will no doubt know more about this than I do, that it's become established at Thurfield Heath and may well become a regular in that region if it can continue. Another peripheral species to Herts and Middlesex is the Duke of Burgundy, which is very much limited to the south central counties of England and some distant colonies in places like Morecambe Bay and the North York Moors. And those two sites are the subject of very intense habitat management, without which it would almost certainly disappear. It's quite strong in the Chilterns, and I think we're probably all familiar with the sites around Ivinghoe Beacon, and one of my favourite spots is Inchcombe Hole, quite a strange part of the Chilterns, which is a sort of dip. It's about 60 meters below the surrounding area, but it's a beautiful little tranquil area where a lot of the species such as Duke of Burgundy, grizzled skipper and the like fly. It's a very good place to see them with a number of tracks running through it. It's and also quite a good site is on Bison Hill on Whipsnade Downs. A lot of conservation efforts been put into these sites, sort of scrub clearance and the planting of cowslips, the larval host plant. And I think there have been records in the Hertfordshire region around on the border around, I believe, Pitstone, from what I can read, but these may be strays rather than signalling any expansion of its range. Go a little bit further abroad now with the northern brown argus, a close relative of brown argus. And the brown argus is widespread and fairly common across the eastern half of England, but its range is limited to those regions. It doesn't occur in Scotland or the western side of northern England, where it's, and I use quote marks here, replaced by the northern brown argus, which is classified as a separate species. In Scotland, the rather iconic form with the white discoidal marks is Artaxerxes, and in northern England the subspecies is, as in the middle row there, top and bottom, Salmassis, which has a similar discoidal mark, which is the sort of more typical black but with white edging. Salmassis is therefore much closer to, in its appearance, to brown argus. And northern brown argus has declined quite substantially, as have most species, and it's usually in very small and separated in colonies. Quite a few people on UK butterflies have recorded that they've travelled up to northern England and Scotland specifically to see it. And in France, just to compare, the species Artaxerxes is known as the mountain argus and is common at high altitudes, and doesn't have the white spot in the discoidal area, and it quite closely resembles brown argus rather than northern brown argus. Another species that we're rather unlikely to see is pale clouded yellow, and this is a very rare migrant to Britain. Although I think in the distant past it reached our shores in greater numbers and with quite considerable regularity. The so-called migrant year of 1945, when there were pretty huge migrations of quite a number of species, there was a very substantial migration of pale clouded yellows to Britain. Most of the records were in the southern counties, so it's quite clear that the migrants came from northern France, where pale clouded yellow isn't uncommon. It has a major element of confusion in that there's a very similar species called the Burgess clouded yellow, and they're said to be indistinguishable on external characteristics. The external margin of the forewing of pale clouded yellow is said to be straight, and the apex is supposed to be pointed. But this is rather variable. But it's true that it's more likely to be pale clouded yellow. The only way you can tell from an upper side view, and I caught this very lucky upper side shot this year, was when a female was rejecting the advances of a male, and you have this pale spot in the middle of the hind wing, and it's quite pale for pale clouded yellow and a bright orange for Burgess clouded yellow. But historically, Burgess clouded yellow was only discovered as a separate species in 1945, and as an interesting fact, it said that most photographs that were labelled as pale clouded yellow in books prior to that were in fact Berger's. And analysis of historical specimens in collections has indicated that some 50 labelled as pale clouded yellow were in fact Berger's, but the probability of seeing either in our region or even anywhere in Britain is actually quite remote. Also in the remote category is this Camberwell Beauty, and I think migrants reach British shores pretty much every year, but in low numbers, and it doesn't breed here, which is a great pity. In some years, there's a particularly large influx, and I think the years of 1976 in particular, 95 and 2006, there were quite a large influx. And most of them seem to come from the east, probably from Scandinavia. And it's said sometimes that some of the migrants to Britain came across in timber stacks on boats where the Camberwell Beauty was trying to hibernate, and they were transported to Britain, and it woke up in a very different place to where it started to hibernate. There were, I believe, 2 sightings in our region in Hertfordshire in the autumn of 2022. So it's not strictly speaking a species that you won't see in our region, just that you have to be exceptionally lucky to see it. It was first recorded in Britain in what was then called Cold Arbour Lane in London, in Camberwell. I think it's now called Cold Harbour Lane. And I think that was in 1748, when clearly Camberwell was a rural area. And it's true to say that there may still be beauties in Camberwell, but they won't look like this anymore. The entomologist who described the discovery, I think his name was Moses Harris, suggested 2 names for it, the Grand Surprise or the Camberwell Beauty, and the latter name stuck and has been with us ever since. But it's also a species that flies in North America, where it's called the mourning cloak, and that's mourning as in grieving rather than the time of day, which I think is probably a more descriptive term for this rather appealing butterfly. Next we have high brown fritillary, another species that, apologies for repeating myself, it was once widespread in England and Wales, but is in very, very strong decline, as I'm sure you know. Since the 1950s, its numbers have dropped alarmingly and is now in serious danger of extinction, and is limited to around 50 sites in the UK. And there's an awful lot of conservation effort into maintaining those sites and its suitability for high brown fritillary. The main colonies are around Morecambe Bay, Dartmoor, Exmoor, and I think there's a single colony in Wales. It's very similar to the much more widespread dark green fritillary, which I've shown bottom left here for comparison. From an upper side view, there's one clear way of distinguishing the males, and that is that with a piece of animation here to show that the sex brands, the high brown fritillary on veins 2 and 3 are quite enlarged, much larger. And this is always the case for high brown fritillary and not the case for dark green. So there are some other indications. It's often said that the forewing margin of high brown is slightly concave. But if you look at those 2 photographs, there's not an awful lot of difference. And like a lot of these wing shape indicators, it can be quite variable and not totally reliable. But the male sex brands is always definitive. Obviously, from an underside point of view, then they're quite easy to distinguish. Next up is a charming little butterfly, the grayling. Another species that is widespread around the coasts of Britain, mostly in the west, but also I think it's got quite a stronghold in East Anglia and on heathland in Surrey. It's a bit of a mystery, maybe somebody knows the answer, that it was quite widespread across Britain and has disappeared from most of its inland haunts, but maintains its coastal colonies quite well. Quite why this should be doesn't appear to be a temperature function, because most of the strongest colonies are in the southwest. And I remember seeing it at Wisley Common in my childhood, because when I was little, my father and my family always went to Worthing for our holidays, and my father had a Morris 8, which couldn't make the journey in one go, but we always stopped at Wisley, and I was always delighted to stop there because I would always be sure of seeing graylings. Top left is the male. It's just got the forewing slightly raised, but when the forewing is dropped below, it has remarkably good camouflage on, for instance, here, lichen covered rocks. And when it's alarmed, it raises the forewing to show the eye spots or ocelli to scare off predators. On the right, grayling always settles with wings closed, but on the right, I borrowed this photo from UK Butterflies, and this is a female with open wings and raised abdomen to reject a male suitor. Next up is the wall butterfly, or used to be called the wall brown. It's widely distributed in England and Wales, but usually in relatively low numbers. Over the last decade, it's declined substantially in inland areas of central England, like the grayling, and it really isn't quite clear. Maybe somebody knows the answer to this, that it's now rather limited to more coastal areas and has disappeared from the sort of central areas of England. Not quite sure why this should be. I mean, it seems to be following the same pattern as the grayling. The male is above with its distinctive pattern. The female has rather more orange, it's a butterfly that used to be widespread, and I actually have records going back to my childhood. I wrote about it in my school diary at junior school, that seeing wall brown in our garden in Boreham Wood. And I think I wrote in my diary at that time that the ones I saw were on their way to Birmingham, but quite how I knew that is still a mystery to me. Next up, a couple of species, Scotch Argus and Aran Brown. The Scotch Argus is one of two Erebia ringlets, or the Erebia genus. They're not ringlets in the sense of the ringlet that we know, ringlet in inverted commas, which is of the genus Aphantopus and is a different family entirely. But these are two of the Erebia species. The other Erebia species is the mountain ringlet, which we'll see later on. It's common, Scotch Argus is common and widespread across Scotland, especially in the north, but it's declined in the southern parts of its range, and in England it's reduced to just 2 isolated sites. And I've been informed that it is actually been spotted in the garden of one of our members of Herts and Middlesex, and if you think that means it occurs in Hertfordshire, I'd have to correct you, because this garden is in the Nairn in the north of Scotland, and from what I could understand, it's Jack Harrison, who's somebody who I know quite well from, he's quite active on the UK Butterflies website. Below this we have Aran Brown, which is another misnamed butterfly, because there's actually no conclusive evidence that it ever occurred on the Isle of Arran, and it certainly doesn't now. Historically, some specimens from the 1800s purport to have been taken on Arran, but as the specimens exist, it's unlikely they've been misidentified, because the undersides would be definitive, but there may be some doubt as to where they were taken. And it seems rather dubious to me that no other records or sightings exist, and that it could have occurred in such small numbers that it then became extinct. Higgins and Riley, if you have the book from, well, I think it was reprinted in 1970, the Higgins and Riley, excellent detailed book on European species, cast doubt on the authenticity of these Aaron Brown records. And Lionel Higgins, one of the authors, was notoriously rigorous in his approach, his requirement for evidence and proof. Lowland specimens of the Scotch Argus, as you can see top middle, are superficially very, very similar to the female Aaron Brown below, although the Aaron Brown margins are checkered and those of the Scotch Argus are not. But there is always slight checkering on some of these female species, and as you can see, it's quite definitive on Aaron Brown, but looks quite checkered on the Scotch Argus as well. Anyway, the name Aaron Brown has continued, and the English names tend to stick, whether they're right or wrong, like Bath White, Camberwell Beauty, Essex Skipper, Lulworth Skipper, etc. Next up, species which might be coming our way, long-tailed blue. It's basically a species of southern Europe, and in France it's limited to very much the sort of lower 1/3 of the country, with isolated pockets dotted around the rest of the country. And it's possibly surprising that its range isn't across the entirety of France, because it's highly migratory and in fact has a distribution very widely across the globe. So it clearly has occurred for many millions of years in exactly the same form. Historically, a small number reach England every year, but in recent years, probably as a result of global warming, its numbers have increased dramatically. And in 2015, some 60 long-tailed blues, or at least those that we know about, crossed the Channel in August of that year, and laid thousands of eggs in gardens and allotments along the south coast. And in 2022, there were a lot of numerous reports, many of which were reported on the pages of UK Butterflies. And I believe that, correct me if I'm wrong, that one even reached Herts and Middlesex in 2021. And it may be that this influx is one of the few positive outcomes of global warming. And it will be interesting to see in future years whether long-tailed blue can actually breed here and become established and become classified as a British species. Next up, Chequered Skipper. It was always a scarce and very localized species in England, but over the decades, changes in woodland management, especially the replacement of deciduous trees by conifers and declining coppicing, resulted in habitat that really wasn't suitable for the Chequered Skipper, and it became extinct, I think, in 1976. Did continue in Scotland, where I think it has about 10 known sites, but they do seem to be discovering new sites all the time for it. With no serious deterioration in Scotland. But as part of Butterfly Conservation's Back from the Brink programme, it was attempted to reintroduce Chequered Skipper into the Rockingham Forest complex in Northamptonshire, one of the Chequered Skipper's previous strongholds. After a lot of research, they decided to use stock from Belgium, which was preferred to the stock from Scotland on the grounds of the similarity of the habitat, and the food plants were more similar to the Belgian race. This involved an awful lot of habitat management and improvement of the location, especially that of creating wide sunny rides in the woodland, which is the sort of preferred habitat of the Chequered Skipper. And in 2018, the project came to fruition when these Chequered Skippers were released into fine shade wood, which is part of the Rockingham Forest complex. And the rest, as they say, is history, in that the Chequered Skipper has thrived and the location is now open to the public, where you can walk through and see it in its natural habitat. And the project is ongoing, especially the habitat management, and looking to facilitate expansion of the site so that it can expand its range. Next, Glanville Fritillary, which is almost virtually restricted to the coastal valleys on the southern half of the Isle of Wight, and a few locations on the mainland. There was one in Somerset on the south-facing banks at Sand Point, which it's reputed was the result of an unofficial release introduction in the early 2000s, and it continued there for quite a few years. And there's quite a few reports on UK butterflies of people who visited there and photographed it. But from what I can read, it appears to have disappeared from that location. And I think there's a location at Hutchinson's Bank in Croydon, where it was introduced about 10 years ago, and it does seem to have survived in that location. Quite what its ecological requirements are in the context of the location in the Isle of Wight is unclear, but it does seem to need the south-facing cliffs with a sufficient erosion for plantain which is the larval food plant, to thrive. But again, contrasting this in France, where it's widespread and reasonably common, and there's no apparent reason why it should be quite so localized and rare in England. It's a species that was named after Lady Eleanor Glanville, who was a lady entomologist of independent means. I have to say that's quite a small group, who was active in the late 17th century. And I think it's true to say that Glanville Fritillary is the only British butterfly that's actually named after a person. Next, wood white, another species that's rapidly declining, previously occurred in much of southern England and eastern Wales, and its primary locations now are in the West Midlands, in Northamptonshire and in East Devon. I remember seeing it at Powerstock Common in Dorset, but I'm not sure if it still continues there, and that was about 40 or 50 years ago. It's double brooded, and the first brood on the top left there has a much greater degree of grey scaling on the hind wing, and the second brood has much less scaling. The males have, if you see the upside, it always settles with closed wings, a much stronger, heavier black apical mark on the forewing than the female. And also another way of determining the sexes is, again, with a piece of animation here. On this female, you can see that the inside of the antennal club is brown, whereas on the male, it's white on the inside. And that's one definitive way of differentiating the sexes, should you wish to. Some of the wood whites, Leptidia sinapis, may actually be the recently discovered Rayal's wood white, Leptidia rayali, which is so similar to sinapis that only an examination of the genitalia can tell them apart, although there are some alleged external differences, or there's some claimed differences, notably that the hind wing band of grey scales is more curved in rayali than in sinapis. And the Rayal's wood white, rayali, is believed to fly in Ireland, except in the Burren, where wood white sinapis flies, which is rather odd in itself. But rayali does not fly in mainland Britain, it would appear, but there's still quite a lot of ongoing debate about that. However, nothing's ever simple in butterfly land, And DNA studies in 2011 showed that a third species existed, for once an accurately named butterfly called the cryptic wood white, Leptidia juvernica. And it appears, from what we know so far, that the Rayal's wood white from Ireland are in fact cryptic wood whites, juvernica, and that juvernica extends across Europe. And actually, DNA study shows that it predates the wood white, Sinapis, and Rayal's wood white. I included this picture of the cryptic wood white top right, and I included the picture, which I always found quite amusing, bottom middle, this is taken in France, of a group of wood whites taking salts from the ground. This wasn't staged at all, but I thought it just looked like a board meeting with the chairman at the top and people arranged either side. Next, the very, very appealing, I used two varies there, Queen of Spain Fritillary. It's a very rare migrant to Britain, first recorded in 1710. And I think after that, it was recorded on a fairly regular basis almost every year into the 1800s. And in the late 1940s, particularly 1945 and a few years after that, a time of very high migrations, another 75 were recorded in arriving in Britain. But after that, things went pretty quiet until about 2009, when there were a few sightings, including a mating pair. Sometimes in talks, I sort of say that there have been 400 sightings since records began, and I do have to correct people because when records began doesn't mean 1953 in butterfly land, it means the early 1700s. So it is pretty scarce. But it's surprising because it is highly migratory. Most of them that arrive in Britain have come across the Channel from northern France, and the number of sightings has increased, but it's unable to survive the British winter. But it's coming across in increasing numbers, and it's just possible it could become established here. There's an awful lot of monitoring going on. It's not really quite clear why it's called the Queen of Spain Fritillary, but apparently the name dates from 1775. Yes, I mentioned earlier, this is the mountain ringlet. It's the other of the two Erebia genus in Britain. And it's the only true montane species in Britain. And it's found on mountains above 350 meters in Scotland, in the Highlands, and around 600-700 meters in the Lake District. And it's probably the most difficult species to observe in the wild, because the colonies are quite remote and discreet, and quite often it's in areas where the weather is quite poor. So it would tend not to fly in very poor conditions. And when the weather is poor, it tends to settle low down in the grass, which tends to explain why most of my photographs of Erebia from the continent have a bit of grass across the image somewhere or other. It's also got a rather short flight period, and on UK butterflies, if I may give them another plug, there's quite a lot of reports of people who've been to Scotland or to, I think, Herts in northern England to see this and recorded photographs. It's a rather unusual butterfly in that there are some 40 to 50 of the Erebia genus across Europe. And mountain ringlet is, whereas most of these are highly localized, mountain ringlet is quite widespread across Europe. And there are a number of subspecies. The alpine subspecies is subspecies Etheria, and in the Pyrenees it's Fauvée. In the Vosges Mountains in eastern France it's Macquarie, and in southern central France in the Cevennes, and in England the English species is Nemon, the the top line with the slightly better developed ocelli, and the Scottish species on the lower line is Scotica. Next, the swallowtail, obviously instantly recognisable. The British race subspecies Britannicus is, as I'm sure everybody's very familiar, limited to the wet fenland and used to occur across Cambridgeshire and Huntingdonshire, but the drainage of the fens in the 1700s, 1800s wiped it out, and it's limited now very much to the Norfolk Broads. Although occasionally migrants do wander out of that region and are recorded elsewhere, or maybe these are bred and released. It's declined in its range dramatically since the 1900s, but there's been very active habitat management in order to stabilise the UK populations. It's now possible to go to areas of the Norfolk Broads, I think Strumpshaw Fen, and see the swallowtail in its natural habitat from boardwalks. The European species is Gorganus, top right, and that's clearly quite clear to differentiate it because it's much more yellow in terms of colour. And there are occasional migrants or vagrants of the European species which arrive on British shores. I also included, just out of interest, the picture at the bottom, a mating pair of swallowtails, because swallowtails, it would appear from what I can understand, are very secretive when they're mating, like many of the venecid species, and apparently this is quite a rare sight. It's actually quite risky. I scrambled up some quite a steep rocky scree to get this photo, which was probably pretty stupid, but I did at least live to tell the tale. Next, dark green fritillary, which it's not strictly true that you won't see it in our region, but you would have to travel in order to see it. It's declined in central and eastern England, but it's still quite locally abundant in western England, around the coast in Wales and Scotland, and is rather rarer in the east. In Herts and Middlesex, it has been recorded, but very much on the borders of the Chilterns, in Thurfield Heath and Hexton Chalk Pit in the north. So technically, it's not a non-Hertfordshire species, but as I say, you'd have to travel some way to see it. There is a dark form of dark green fritillary, which is known as Scotica, and it's found, not too surprisingly, in Scotland. Although I include bottom right this photograph I took at Martin Down near Salisbury of this rather sort of dark and dusky female, which is very similar to the Scotica form. Next up, silver spotted skipper, which seems to be considered to be a localised and possibly even quite a rare skipper, restricted to chalk downs in southern England, but can be seen in the Chilterns. But its strongholds are in the North and South Downs and Dorset, Hampshire and Wiltshire, so basically South Central England. It's declined over the last 60 years, but over the last few years it has re-expanded its numbers and its range for reasons that aren't particularly apparent. Very similar, superficially similar to the large skipper, although I'm not sure if they ever fly together. But for the silver spotted skipper, the upper sides, the male and the female, are much darker than the large skipper, and the forewing margin has this quite distinct degree of concavity, but it gets its name from the spots on the underside, which are usually white or slightly creamy yellow, and certainly not silver, so it's not terribly well named in that respect. And that clearly differentiates it from the large skipper from an underside view, where the large skipper does have spots in these regions, but they're quite often quite low contrast, and you have to look closely to see that they're even there. Next, marsh fritillary, which again, sorry if I start every description by saying it was once widespread in Britain, but has declined severely over the past 100 years and is now confined to Western England, the west coast of Scotland, South and West Wales, and one or two other colonies where it's been reintroduced. The colonies are actually quite volatile and require pretty careful habitat management in its remaining colonies, and as butterfly conservation is very aware of that. A lot of effort goes into maintaining these colonies. These two images of the upper sides, the male and the female, were taken at a site in Lincolnshire. I think it's quite a well-known site, where it had been successfully introduced. And again, it's a very good site because you can walk around the site on tracks and not have to disturb the habitat. But considering its ecological requirements in England, surprising consideration is that in France, there are something like about 10 different forms, ranging from almost completely orange to almost completely black, which have adapted to quite a wide variety of different terrains. So why it should be so adaptable in just across the channel, and why it should be so limited in its specific requirements on this side of the channel is something of a mystery. It was, talking of original names, it was originally known as the Greasy Fritillary. So I don't think anybody would complain too much that actually that's one name that didn't, original name that didn't stick. Next, Bath White, which is an extremely rare migrant to Britain. And in some years we don't get any here at all. There have been occasions of major influxes, mostly in the, and I use this again, the quotes, the migration year of 1945, with most of them arriving in Cornwall. But very few records prior to this and after this, with the exception, it would appear in 1906, when a large number were seen at Durdle Door in Dorset on the coast. But there's a strong suspicion that this was a misidentification, because basically it's very similar to a number of other white species, and this may be a clue to its possible misidentification. That might also explain the paucity of records. And there have been very few records in the last 70 years, since about 1950, since that mass migration. The origin of its name is even more spurious than most. It apparently arises from an embroidery of a specimen taken near Bath in 1795, which strikes me as very tenuous in the extreme as to name its Bath White, but these names tend to stick once they're in books. The male has the apical markings on the forewing, but very little on the hindwing. The female is much more strongly marked, both on the forewing and on the hindwing. And the green scales of the underside, bottom left there, green in inverted commas, are not actually green. When you look at them closely, it's a mixture of yellow and black scales, which give the appearance of green. And finally, we finish with a success story. I'm sure it's one that would be very familiar, but it's always nice to hear of a success story. It was first recorded as a British species in 1795. It's always been rare, and the loss of habitat reduced it to one site in Dartmoor. And when that was lost, it became extinct, I think, around 1979, 1980. You do occasionally see adverts from things that, because I get quite a lot of this stuff sent to me having a website, of guaranteed or authenticated British specimens pre-1979, set specimens, but strongly suspected that many of these are not the case. Anyway, after it became extinct, there were many attempts to conserve it at the last site, but they were unsuccessful. And there was a lot of head scratching as to why it couldn't be maintained. And a lot of effort was put into research into what were its precise ecological requirements. The leader of this was Dr. Jeremy Thomas. And what they discovered was very surprising, as I think, as I say, is very well known, is that the large blue, as do many blues, has a relationship with red ants of the Myrmica genus, notably Sabuletti, and this relationship is vital to the life cycle, in that the large blue larvae, where the eggs are laid on wild thyme, and when they reach instar, I think it's 3 or possibly 4, they drop to the ground and they're transported by the ants to the ant's nest and fed ant grubs, which sounds very unlike ant behavior. But the reason for this is that the larvae excrete a honey-like liquid, which is, or sorry, secrete, not excrete, which is very appealing to the ants, and presumably the ant alternative to cocaine. That's when it continues through install 5, pupates, and then emerges through the ant's nest. And when this was discovered, it became clear that the habitat had to be managed for the ants, and that grazing was essential to maintain a short sward. And this was done effectively by rabbits, which might have contributed to the disappearance of large blue, the disappearance of rabbits through myxomatosis, etc., or grazing by sheep and cows, the intervention of humans. But I have to say, I can never quite work out, if this is necessary to its survival, how did the large blue survive before humans brought cows and sheep to graze the land? And I believe rabbits were introduced by the Romans, so how did it survive before that? Anyway, once that was discovered, stock from Sweden was introduced, and the project has been phenomenally successful, and it's now expanded to cover something like 10 or more sites in Western England, and I think the population is estimated to be around 10,000 large blues on the wing. And it's possible to go to the open access site at Collard Hill and see the large blue in its natural habitat. And the habitat management continues by organisations such as Butterfly Conservation to focus on the ecological needs of the ants as much as for the butterfly and the wild thyme. And that concludes this talk. Thank you very much. And I'll press stop share and see. Thank you. Back to you, Malcolm.
Well, thanks, Roger. That was a very interesting talk. I think we've got a bit of time if you're happy to take any questions. There are an awful lot of comments going in through the in the chat room, which I won't attempt to read all of them out. But if anyone would like to ask a question, do you want to perhaps unmute and show yourself on screen? If you don't want to put your video on, then if you don't want to be on the recording, then just ask a question. But we've got we've got one from Michael Hammerson that's appeared in the chat room, so I'll read it out, which is: when did it become Fengarus Marion? Us old guard always knew it as Maculini. Can't keep up.
Please don't get me started on the taxonomists. it was probably about 5 or 6 years ago now. It's really is incredibly tedious. If you have a website, you have to keep changing the names all the time. The taxonomists who meet periodically every year, or there's debate going on all the time.
Sorry, Roger, I think I've inadvertently muted you. You need to unmute again.
Is that better? Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
So yes, the taxonomists changed this, and they have been known to change the names 5 years later, to change them back to what they were before. And they always say, this is the final classification. They won't change now, but nobody trusts them anymore. So what I do on my website basically is I put the names that I've used. And one of the problems is that for things like high brown fritillary and dark green, these used to be the Argus genus, but now they've changed them. So we've got Fabriciana and Spearia, etc. But it was very nice to classify them all as Argus, and that lumped them together as a group. But what I put on my website basically is the names they're known by now, what they did in 2010, 2017, 2019, so that people can track the name change. But yes, the problem is everybody looks for Maculinia, and calling them Fengaris doesn't actually help. I agree totally.
Right. Okay. Question from Dick Ashford. He says, can you tell us your web address?
Oh, it's on French butterflies, I'm afraid. It's butterfliesofrance.com. There's all one word, butterflies of France, if you wish to look. But I mean, obviously all the English species are there, but it is essentially for French species.
Okay. While you were going through, Roger, I was checking off on my Butterflies of Hertfordshire book by Brian Sawford about which species used to be present in Hertfordshire, and I was quite surprised actually. The majority of butterfly species you mentioned did used to either be residents or common migrants in Hertfordshire. A lot of them were not particularly common, but I noted 4 in particular, which was pearl-bordered, high brown, fritillaries, large tortoiseshell and wall. All of those used to be quite widespread in our in Hertfordshire and quite a lot in Middlesex as well. So it's certainly been a huge change over the last 100 years or so in how many butterflies we've got. We're just wondering what we can do to encourage them all back again.
Malcolm, I was just going to say we're going to trying to do a walk to Inchcombe Hill this year.
Inchcombe Hole, yeah.
Inchcombe Hole, yeah.
Yeah.
Plan to do a walk. It probably the end, third week in May, probably will be. But we'll try.
Yeah, the branch program of walks is being put together at present, and it should come out to members in April. But there will be opportunities to see things like green hairstreak, Duke of Burgundy, and other relatively rarer butterflies that we can see either in our area or, as Steve's saying, just outside the borders. But I think of all the butterflies that we might get back, probably Duke of Burgundy seems potentially the nearest. It's certainly been seen in Hertfordshire in the last 2 years after a long gap, both years at all Brunoas, and we are, as a branch, we are in discussions with the landowners there at present to try and change, make some tweaks to the management and increase the size of that site to get Dukes thriving there once again.
Can I suggest Steve, that you mentioned going on a walk to Inchcombe Hole, that you monitor the Upper Thames branch sightings page, because Duke of Burgundy 2022 was an exceptionally early year. I think they were flying there even at the end of April, and I think if it's going to be as early a year as that again, you might find you'll possibly be even too late for the flight period, or certainly right at the end of it. So it's worth checking the Upper Thames branch sightings page. They were certainly put up when they first seen Dukes, and if you've got flexibility as to when you can go there, you might need to move fairly quickly.
I'm pondering that, but I'm planning to do a walk with 2 groups next year. So even if people can't make the one that we do with the Herts and Middlesex, there'll be another opportunity to them to join me up there. But it's a lovely site, and I only discovered it last year because one of the different group told me about it, and I went out there on a perfect day, the middle of May. And I mean, there was obviously the lots of Duke of Burgundies, Brown Argus, Dingy Skipper, Grizzle Skipper, the Green Hair Streak as well, all in a very, very small area, and Common Blue, and it was brilliant.
Yeah.
Can I just say that I believe the National Trust do like to know when groups are visiting, because it can affect the parking, which is quite difficult in those areas. So they do like to know ahead, and you'd give them your records. So I know that's something we have to do from the Upper Thames branch.
That's the National Trust, is it?
It's Inchcombe Hole, and all that area is National Trust.
Yeah, I know. I know the car park is National Trust, isn't it? There,
yeah.
They are the landowner there, and all the land over to and including Albury Knowers as well. So they have a very large estate in the area. It's probably worth mentioning though as well that they're all the butterfly walks that other branches put on are listed on Butterfly Conservation's national events site, which you can is easily searchable. So if you want to go on butterfly walks in see butterflies we don't have in Hertfordshire, then it's well worth having a look at what other branches are doing, and people are always very welcome to go along and join them if they've got walks looking for species.
Can I just say, when I'm preparing the walks, we check with all the other branches, and we do consult the other, if it's like the Herts and Middlesex Wildlife Trust, we get their permission. So these are all covered before the actual date is covered, the actual walk's covered. But also we tend to have to, when we set a date, we have to work it out and just hope, because 1 year's early, then the next year's late. We just have to go somewhere in the middle. So if we say went too early, then if this winter continues to be quite chilly, then everything's going to be late. We've had years when the Purple Emperors, we've planned Purple Emperor walks for the end of June, and they're not flying till July. So you just have to hit a date somewhere in the middle that hopefully there will be activity. We can't just when you're planning the program, you just have to go for it and hope for the best.
There's a couple more questions come in from on the chat room from Michael Hammerson. One is the official long-term government and business attitude towards habitat protection a contributor to our dismal record in species decline? And then another one, should we be trying to introduce rare species to suitable habitats, such places as Hampstead Heath? Roger, do you want to try one or both of those?
You'd be very brave to go into the question of introducing non-native species. It seems to create quite a lot of acrimony in either direction. There seems to be a lot of people who think you should introduce them, a lot of people who think that if they're not there naturally. Whether is marsh fritillary surviving in Thurfield Heath? Did it survive there? Adonis Blue, no. I think.
No, the marsh there have been a number of attempted marsh fritillary releases around the area over the last few years, and they've all failed. As I think 99% of all marsh fritillary releases have failed everywhere they've happened. So it's a difficult species to it's, as with most species, you have to have the right habitat, and if you've got the right habitat, there's a good chance it will find it naturally. The main problem, as Michael's alluded to in his first question, is the loss of habitat, rather than introducing species usually does fail unless there's a lot of work being done on the habitat. I mean, there's good examples have probably been the large blue, which was just unbelievable, phenomenal amount of work went into researching and preparing habitat for that, and the more recent Chequered Skipper introductions at Rockingham Forest, which have is still early days, but they seem to have gone quite well so far. But again, that's a project that Butterfly Conservation's researched in a lot of detail and done a lot of work on to try and make that do well. Generally, sort of unofficial releases don't go well. Perhaps Thurfield Heath, the Adonis Blue release is an exception, but that is a site that probably was fairly well suited to that species, but whether it will survive there long term or not, we don't know. It is extremely isolated and well away from any other Adonis Blue colonies, and the problem is that it's often they get very inbred because there's no likelihood of other butterflies coming in and interbreeding with them, so you get a very narrow genetic pool, which I suspect is possibly a reason why some of our rarer species do die out, is that they just they have endless inbreeding, and it tends not to be that that great genetically when that happens. So all of the work we do is as Butterfly Conservation is trying to encourage larger numbers of sites and butterflies that live in lots of different places all across the landscape, and not the old approach of having one or two little nature reserves dotted around with small colonies is not really considered the right way to go about it nowadays.
But I noticed with Thurfield Heath, they've stopped grazing it with sheep now, and I noticed deterioration of wildflowers there last year was quite significant because of the sheep are not grazing it anymore.
Do you
I think that's something we need
We
to
can't
look
get
into.
grazers due to the dogs.
Yeah, I know it's the dogs, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's so many dogs, especially in the lockdown and everything.
We have one person who will do Churchill, but not more widely.
Yeah, it's a shame.
But
I think Roger, you were talking about why the French have so many have such a big population of certain butterflies, and they have different farming regimes there, and they have smaller herds of cows. Well, certainly in the bits of France I've been to. I wonder if that makes a difference.
I just think there's far more open space in France. So much of France is completely untouched, whereas by farming or pesticides or development, whereas I don't think that's true in England. But you get a species like Heath Fritillary, which just seems to occur everywhere. Everywhere you go, you see Heath Fritillary. Maybe there are reasons that I don't understand, that other people know pretty well, as to what is different in France, because it's even in northern France. We're not talking about southern France where it's warmer. And the same with Adonis Blue and even Swallowtail. Swallowtail not restricted to wetland areas in France at all. It uses fennel and is quite often a montane species. So there's a PhD in there for somebody.
Just a thought on that. The continent is not only warmer, but it also gets a lot colder. And there is some implication that wet winters can have an adverse effect on some pupa and the like of some species. So I wonder if that's an issue.
Might be. Mm.
Yeah, I think that could well be the case. You know, there's probably a complex factors involved, and I'm sure, you know, genetics and climate differences and you know, just the fact that we're quite isolated are all factors. But I think overall, certainly in southern Britain, the amount of intensive farming and you know, the degree to which the countryside has been adapted is significantly more than is normal in France. But probably overall, the fact we're a bit of a colder country has been maybe one of the most decisive factors. But obviously that is changing a bit, and I think I'm right in saying we've had 5 butterflies that had died out in Hertfordshire and Middlesex that have reappeared in over the last 20 years of warmer weather. So who's to say that we won't get more coming back over the next 20 years or so? It would be nice to see.
I'm optimistic. Let's see. Wall Brown back in Hertfordshire. That's what I say. I'd say we can do that.
Yeah, well, I think that's certainly a realistic ambition. I have heard, you know, it has, as Roger said, it has died out in large amounts of central England, but in other parts in the north and the coasts and southwest, it still seems to be doing quite well. And you know, whatever's caused it to die out could reverse. And you know, things we've had the same.
This is where
historically to you know, speckled wood died out altogether, and then sort of came back under its own steam. So you know, there were factors at play that were, you know, we don't really know what they were, but you know,
you need a PhD student, as Roger says, to do those kind of things, to see if that can happen.
Yeah,
in a realistic way.
Right. Have we got any other questions before we wrap up?
No, I'll say fantastic, Roger, for the experience of, and your photography is absolutely amazing. Brilliant.
Great. Okay, yeah, well, I certainly echo that, Roger. Thanks ever so much for the talk. For those of you who were here at the start, to say the next talk is going to be on big city butterflies, which is on Tuesday the 21st, and that's one you have to book for. So click on the link that came round in the invitation to the talks, and you'll be able to get onto that and hear about all the amazing things that are being done in London to you could spread butterflies around there. Good. Okay. Well, I don't think there's any. Cool.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, the only other thing I'd say, I will the YouTube recording I'll put up tomorrow. And if you do want to see any of the other previous talks or even last year's talks, then they're all on the YouTube channel. And if you missed the one on Ghana butterflies, just absolutely amazing, some stunning images of some amazing butterflies that definitely well worth looking out for. But thanks for dropping in, and see you again next time. Bye.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Roger.
Thanks, Malcolm.
Don't worry, Pete, I'll turn it off for you.